I want to welcome everyone to the 2023 Cammett Lecture. We are very pleased this year to have Dr. Kim Welch from Vanderbilt University. Without really further ado, I think, we'll be talking about Eulalie's Vanderbilt's money. Mandeville, oh my goodness. Thank you very much, Professor Welch.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Can everybody hear me okay? I'm pretty loud, so if I don't need this, I might push it. I do. Okay, I need it. All right. I need it. Okay. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you to Sarah and to David for the invitation. It's such a pleasure to be here in this beautiful space and to talk about a really remarkable woman that I have been researching in the last couple of years. This is the first time that I'm actually giving a real talk about her, so it's just wonderful to be here to do that. And so I'm going to talk about this woman, Eulalie Mandeville, and a court case involving her money in the 19th century New Orleans, and then some takeaways about what I think is important when we think it through. So I look forward to your comments and your questions. So let's get started. All right, so on September 19th, 1846, Eugene McCarty's white collateral heirs sued Eulalie Mandeville, Eugene's intimate partner of 50 years, and a free woman of color. Eugene's brother, Theodore McCarty, spearheaded the lawsuit, and 44 of Eugene's white relatives joined him. They each claimed portions of Eugene's estate, and the amount they sought was not inconsiderable. Eulalie, the plaintiffs insisted, illegally possessed $112,000 in cash, a building valued at $11,000, 6 lots of ground purchased for $5,800, and 6 enslaved people worth a collective $4,500. Over the years, they claimed Eugene had illegally purchased property and deposited large sums of money in the bank under Eulalie's name with the fraudulent purpose of violating the law and depriving his legitimate heirs of his estate. And he did this, they said, to circumvent a Louisiana law that forbade the donation of property to, quote, concubines. And they said that while Eulalie had little herself, Eugene had made an immense fortune lending money at usurious rates. And in an attempt to keep his money for herself, she withdrew $112,000 from the Bank of Louisiana 23 days before Eugene died. And what is more, she was in possession of the land, the building, and the slaves, all property they thought should be in their hands. So they wanted the cash and then the proceeds from the sale of the property returned to Eugene's estate and then divided among his so-called legitimate heirs, these 45 people fighting for it. And then they wanted Eulalie to pay interest, court costs, and anything else that the court deemed just. All right, make sure this is, there we go. You gotta press it hard. All right, so a month later, Eulalie answered the petition and denied all of their allegations, and then the trial court in New Orleans set a court date. And the property was hers, she said in response, not Eugene's, and the fruits of a long and productive life. As an unmarried woman, Eulalie could act in her own name before the law and in the economy, which was something that married women, either white or black, could not do at this time. And by doing so, she was able to build and operate a vast and successful business in her own right. All told, Eulalie later revealed, she was worth $155,000, which is $5 million in today's money, a sum that made her a wealthy woman in New Orleans and the richest black businesswoman in the country. And if we just go by today's numbers, we might consider Eulalie to be basically America's first black millionaire. So in my talk today, I'm going to be discussing this court case and what it meant for Eulalie and her family, and there's a lot to unpack. McCarty v. Mandeville lasted 2 years. It spanned more than 350 pages of written testimony and evidence, so it's a really thick, big file. It involved some of New Orleans' leading families, and it embodied several vexing issues of the day in the 19th century United States. So from the moral and social implications implications of mixed-race relationships to the sanctity of property in a slave society. And I'm going to touch on all of these issues a little bit, but my real focus today when discussing the case of Eulalie Mandeville's money will be on inheritance and intergenerational wealth transfer. All right. So at the heart of this case, I think, sits a deceptively simple question. In whose hands should wealth sit? And to Southern slaveholding whites, Eugene's white relatives included, the answer to this question was self-evident: with them. Right? This was, after all, a slave society built on the capacity to own human beings, and it was black people, not whites, who were held as private property. Privately held property was a symbol of whiteness. But as we'll see, the answer to the question of who should and who did hold wealth was far from clear. And what we'll see at work in the narratives presented by Eugene's white destinataires on the one hand, and Eulalie on the other, was a set of competing understandings about property and lineage and their relationship to race. So according to the plaintiffs, Eulalie was a black concubine and a small-time peddler, a person whose race and gender made her illegitimate as a legal wife and incapable of being an economic actor of any gravity. And much less, they thought, was she worthy of respect, especially the sort due to households and lineages like their own, which of course such respect is highly racialized in this society, right? So, and she had moreover committed fraud, they said, and that she had anything of substance at all to pass on to her children resulted from this fact. So Eugene's estate then should return to the bosom of his white family. But for Eulalie, by contrast, the case concerned the proceeds of her hard work and her sharp mind, certainly, and the property in question was, in fact, hers. But most importantly, the lawsuit involved her right to secure a future for her children, the specific right contested by Eugene's white heirs who contended that the transfer of wealth should never benefit the mixed race and, in their words, illegitimate offspring of a bird of prey. Right, a set of evocative images to which I'll return a little later. So the litigants then compelled the courts to consider the importance ascribed to the creation and the perpetuation of systems of family wealth, of power and control, of lineage, and the threat posed by so-called inferior or excluded people to these frameworks, as they viewed people of African descent to be. But when facing the evidence, the courts did indeed choose to protect, in the words of the lower court judge, the stability of fortunes, but just not in the way that we might expect in a racial caste society that was antebellum Louisiana. All right, so let's start with a little brush clearing and some background on Eulalie and Eugene, her partner. So Eulalie Mandeville was born enslaved in 1774. Her father, military commander and planter Pierre-Philippe de Mandeville de Marigny, pictured here, was one of the largest landholders in the region. He was worth approximately $7 million when he died, so he was one of the wealthiest men in Louisiana. Her mother was enslaved, but Pierre and his parents manumitted both Eulalie and her mother, and they included Eulalie as a full and legitimate member of the family. According to her lawyers, her white relatives treated her with, quote, regard, confidence, and affection. She grew up in Pierre's mother's household, raised and educated by a white grandmother who loved and who nurtured her. Her half-siblings, so Pierre's children with his white wife, considered Eulalie their true sister. Pierre set up Eulalie in business, gifting her $3,000 in cash, a large tract of land in St. Bernard Parish, and 60 to 80 head of cattle that she used to run a dairy. And letters from her father included in the trial court record demonstrate that he showed the most affectionate feelings toward her and considerable confidence in her judgment. He consulted her on plantation business and the construction of buildings, thanked her for things like making him shirts, and inquired after her children and his grandchildren, and then signed the letters with love and well wishes. And so Eulalie used the money given to her by her father and then the proceeds of her dairy and other ventures to begin a mercantile trade. And by the time she and Eugene began their relationship in 1793, she had already embarked on the business that would make her a wealthy woman in her own right. And that was as a dry goods dealer of high-end French imports. All right, so Eugene McCarty, meanwhile, was also born into a prominent Louisiana family. His father spent much of his life as an esteemed military man in French-controlled Illinois country, and then later settled on a plantation outside of New Orleans. He died in 1781 without leaving a will, and his 11 children divided his estate between them. And some of his siblings rose to prominence. So, for example, his brother Louis followed his father's footsteps and had a wonderful military career. His sister Celeste married the governor of Spanish Louisiana. Other members of the McCarty family fared a little less well. Theodore, Eugene's brother and the lead plaintiff in the lawsuit, spent much of his life destitute and reliant on others for his upkeep. Eugene's brother was murdered by his slaves on his plantation outside of New Orleans. And then we have Marie, let me if I can get this, oh, there we go. Then we have Marie Delphine McCarty Lollery. So are there many people in the audience who've been to New Orleans? Anybody taken a ghost tour? All right. Well, if you do, you will visit her home. So Marie Delphine McCarty Lollery was Eugene's niece. She's another of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit. And she gained notoriety for fleeing an angry mob after the discovery of several starved and tortured slaves chained to her stove or otherwise confined in her Royal Street mansion. And if you look her up, she'll come up as New Orleans' serial killer or something like that. But she remains infamous today. At any given time in New Orleans, one can find crowds of tourists gathered in front of her French Quarter home. It's a favored stop on the ghost tours. I'm not sure, I don't know if serial killer is the right way to describe her, but this is part of the shtick for that. And if you've seen American Horror Story, I believe it's Kathy Bates who plays her in that. So that's Madame Lollery, Eugene's niece, and one of the people going after Eulalie's money. All right, now I can show you the Marigny plantation. There you go. All right, so when Eugene met Eulalie, he had recently returned from Europe. He was penniless and he was in debt to his sister for $2,000, a loan she extended him to help him get on his feet. His family situated him on a plantation adjacent to the Marigny property, and although he returned from France having spent his inheritance, he wasn't idle. He rented land from Eulalie and on it raised vegetables to market, and then he cut and sold firewood. And there, on her land, they began their family. And with the blessing of her father and grandmother, Eulalie and Eugene formed what was really a formal relationship. This was, in the words of her lawyers, quote, a pseudo-marriage, a serious connection, they continued, entered into with the consent of her family, the nearest approach to marriage the law would permit, and looked upon as morally binding. Okay, so sex across the color line between white men and free and enslaved women of African descent was, as I'm sure people know, not unusual in Louisiana. But intimate encounters ranged from life partnerships like the one between Eugene and Eulalie to much more commonly violent acts of rape, of sexual assault, and coercion. And Eulalie's own position as a beloved member of one of the region's most prominent families in all likelihood protected her, because by all appearances she was free to make choices. Others were not. So the contours of Pierre's relationship with Eulalie's enslaved mother, for example, are unclear. And we want to remember that although he freed her, at the same time he manumitted their daughter. When she conceived and gave birth to Eulalie, she was Pierre's property. But a black woman entering into a serious marriage-like partnership with a white man happened with some frequency in early Louisiana, and Eulalie and Eugene's relationship was, by all accounts, highly successful. It emulated legal marriage in striking ways, and it lasted for 5 decades. They're buried together in the same New Orleans tomb. Still, Louisiana law banned marriages between blacks and whites, and so legally, Eulalie remained a single woman. And this status as a single woman will have important legal and economic consequences later on for her, both positive and negative. So Eulalie and Eugene established a household. They had several children that they raised together with care. And while their children benefited from the wealth of both parents, Eugene financed their education. He sent some of them to the north. I believe the daughters were sent to France. And he established them in business. And he also officially recognized his sons and daughters as his natural children. So a natural child is a legal condition that separates them from the designation of a bastard, and bastard is also a legal condition. And it's one that had both social and financial benefits. So this recognition in some ways tempers the stigma of illegitimacy, but it also provided the children with a claim to Eugene's property, both during his lifetime and then upon his death. And let's see, make sure this goes. Maybe not. You want to do the next slide for me? Thank you. Sorry. There we go. Okay. So as natural children, the Mandeville-McCarty clan acquired the right to monetary support for their care. And in addition, unlike bastards, natural children could inherit, although there are definitely limitations to what they could receive. So I want to pause here for a minute and say a few things about the Louisiana law of inheritance, because that's what this case is about. So beginning in 1808, but especially in 1825, Louisiana passed laws limiting what natural children could inherit. So if the deceased, in this case Eugene, remained unmarried, but had any legitimate relatives whatsoever, so however distant, that could be a brother, a niece, a second cousin, doesn't matter, any distant relatives, then natural children could only inherit 1/3 of their father's estate. If he married and had legitimate children, then natural children could not receive anything more than what was absolutely necessary for their immediate care. So they're shutting down the ability to pass property. But then 1825 law also restricted what Eugene could give Eulalie, either before or after death. So with this law, then, Eulalie could not receive any immovable property at all, so no land, no buildings, that sort of thing. Nor could she receive any gifts of cash. She could receive movable property, so clothing, dishes, furniture, but only a very small percentage of the overall estate. So in an effort to dissuade white men from interracial relationships and procreation, the law intended to keep white property out of the hands of black women and their children. And it was this law that the plaintiffs relied on when mounting their case against Eulalie. Let's see if I can, or did you do that? Oh, okay, so now it's working, thank you. All right, so let's move on to the case itself. I want to begin with the accusations of the plaintiffs. And again, these are Eugene's white collateral heirs, so his distant relatives, ranging from his brother to nieces and cousins and so on. All right, so the plaintiffs allege fraud. They claimed that for more than 20 years, Eugene and Eulalie evaded the 1825 law that forbade the donation of property to concubines. And in his will, written just days before his 1845 death, Eugene followed the law actually quite precisely, bequeathing nearly all of his estate to his white heirs, so to his brother, to a godson, and a niece. He provided his natural children with $300, and he left Eulalie nothing. Yet his white relatives were far from satisfied by this. According to the plaintiffs, Eugene was a wealthy man, and the $12,000 named in his estate in no way represented the immense fortune that they believed that he possessed. He was worth at least $100,000, the plaintiffs insisted, probably more. Eulalie then held that property in her name, passed to her fraudulently through disguised sales and deposits. So they said that when Louisiana tightened its restrictions on mixed-race relationships and banned the transfer of property to concubines, Eulalie and Eugene reacted accordingly and began a deceptive practice. Eugene would funnel money to her, basically. He would pretend that his money was hers. He'd give it to her to lend out at interest, and then she would deposit the proceeds in her bank account. And for 2 decades, they kept up this ruse with the purpose of keeping Eulalie's estate from the plaintiff, his legitimate heirs. So every transaction, they said, was a cheat, meant to transfer one of New Orleans' great fortunes to a concubine and her illegitimate children. All right, so let's pause for a second and talk about concubinage. That Eugene's white collateral heirs repeatedly used the term concubine over and over again in the record when referring to Eulalie is significant, and it was deliberate. It was, first of all, a legal status. So concubines were not wives. Concubines were not eligible for the protections and obligations of marriage. So as a concubine, the plaintiffs gestured, Eulalie had no hold on Eugene's property, and the law owed her nothing, right? But second of all, and more importantly, this term was highly racialized. And in the slave society that was antebellum Louisiana, the plaintiffs were using it to also signify the relationship between illegitimacy, between sexuality, and race. So it was really important to them to signal to the court that Eugene was not just a concubine, that she was not a wife, but also a woman of color. And as we will see, that made her especially threatening. So using such terms over and again was a conscious strategy because the plaintiffs assumed that the court would recognize, would share, and would reward their viewpoints and their values. All right, so the evidence that the plaintiffs submitted to support their accusations of deceit, however, was thin, at best thin. So they depended entirely on the distant memories of witnesses whose testimony actually aided the defense most of the time. And when that didn't work, they moved to conjecture, and then finally, in an argument before the state Supreme Court about why property should pass to whites and not to people of African descent, to insults. All right, so how did they do this? So they began by using oral testimony. Oh, my interesting question, says my watch. Well, that's never happened before. Of course it is, that's right. How did they do this? All right. Well, so they began, Siri, by using oral testimony to establish Eugene's industriousness and his entrepreneurial spirit. So witnesses for the plaintiffs, and I should just say that this case is just full of witness testimony. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of them. So witnesses for the plaintiff agreed that in 1792, just before he set up a household with Eulalie, Eugene borrowed $2,000 from his sister, and he entered into business. And for the next 53 years, they argued, he worked tirelessly and built a vast fortune. He started out modestly, selling firewood and vegetables and milk, but with the proceeds, he began to lend money at high rates of interest, and he proved to be a talented businessman. He quickly became wealthy. So the plaintiff's entire case hung on Eugene's reputation as a rich man. As a creditor, discounter, occasional broker, Eugene's business associates would testify, hundreds of thousands of dollars moved through his hands. So his estate then should hold at least $100,000, not this paltry sum of $12,000. And they brought witness after witness forward to testify to Eugene's reputation as a wealthy man. So, for example, one acquaintance of 45 years testified that in the wake of the financial upheaval of the late 1930s, where we had two financial panics and a great wave of bankruptcies, so in the wake of that, he pressed Eugene about the size of his fortune, and he said this: "But you, Eugene, you are still a man of $300,000. And McCarty answered him, no, you can deduce 2/3. $100,000 was the amount of his fortune. And it was testimony like this that provided the plaintiffs with the evidence to show that $100,000 should be in the estate. Other witnesses claimed that they had always heard that McCarty was rich, or he had the reputation of being a rich capitalist, or he passed for a rich man. So this is what they say over and over. But the plaintiffs were unable to produce tangible evidence to support their thesis about Eugene's enormous fortune. So, for example, when the court ordered a meeting of auditors to come together to examine the finances of both Eugene and Eulalie, that meeting ended like in 2 seconds. It ended really fast because the plaintiffs admitted that they, quote, had no accounts to present. And for her part in the record, Eulalie comes forward here and states that, yeah, I possess accounts, but I'm not going to reveal them until later when I have a chance to present my defense. And so, in other words, she's kind of letting them hang themselves here. Instead of accounts, though, the plaintiffs presented witnesses who corroborated Eugene's long career as a moneylender. And to be sure, this is really lucrative work at this time period, so credit was in high demand. Not only was there a shortage of circulating coinage, so you didn't have physical money, but the configuration of an agricultural economy in the slaveholding U.S. South in particular meant that few Southerners could avoid doing business on credit. You have to wait for the harvest, right? So Eugene began lending at interest as early as 1802. Witnesses testified to his many decades as a creditor, and they said that he lent money on a large scale, often enormous sums, and boasted a big, well-stocked purse. And this well-stocked purse was in part the result of very large interest payments. He was no stranger to usury, charging upwards of 21 to 27% interest, sometimes even more. I don't know. So through witness testimony, the plaintiffs established that Eugene should be rich, but they could not establish that he was rich, right? And so his associates recalled significant sums of money moving through his hands, but the plaintiffs offered very little in the form of receipts or accounts or any documentation to substantiate their version of events. In addition, they were unable to show that the money with which Eugene dealt was in fact his. Instead, their own witnesses noted that the funds actually belonged to Eulalie. So, for example, one witness, a man named Andre Seindexter, testified that he had borrowed money regularly from Eugene for 23 years, and that the promissory notes were always in the name of Eulalie Mandeville. Another said that although he couldn't recall if Eulalie signed the checks, Eugene told him that he conducted business on Eulalie's account, and that he, quote, heard it said in public that McCarty used Eulalie Mandeville's money. So he acted as her manager, they said. All right, and then finally, despite considerable evidence to the contrary, the plaintiffs also sought to delegitimize Eulalie as a successful merchant by downgrading her to a small-time peddler of cheap trinkets with few customers. And it was with this line of questioning that the plaintiffs were trying to show that Eulalie could never have made this kind of money, that she could never hold this much on her own, whereas Eugene, the moneylender, would have made a fortune. And while they didn't get very far this time, the plaintiffs would revive this line of argument, along with others, later when facing the state Supreme Court of Louisiana. All right. All right. Here we go. All right, so I'll move on now to Eulalie's defense. These are just two of her homes. So, in her defense, at the trial, Eulalie presented a straightforward story. The property in question belonged to her truly honestly and legally. She had, she said, accumulated $155,000 in cash, immovables, and personal property over the course of her long and enterprising life. As a young woman, her father provided her with assistance to start a dairy and to set her up in business. She remained on the family plantation until her paternal grandmother died in 1799, but by then she was already selling luxury imports to wealthy women in the region. And once she moved to New Orleans, this trade became even more extensive and profitable, and one she continued with great success for 40 more years. So she oversaw a really sizable enterprise, one that extended from New Orleans to the rural plantation districts beyond it. She purchased goods from importers and wholesale merchants and sold the high-end items, so things like parasols or silk handkerchiefs, muslin, and other luxury fabrics, to her numerous wealthy clients. And she was well situated to do so, as New Orleans was a cosmopolitan place and linked to the culture and the goods of the broader Atlantic world. So many of her wares shipped from France, and several clients requested that she alert them when she received deliveries. Merchants sent her their lists of new products, and then she sold them to the wealthy ladies of the city. And this was a trade that made her rich. Witnesses familiar with the industry pointed to the profitability of this line of business and noted that all who engaged in it did well. But in this business, they also said, Eulalie was unmatched. And she had a reputation that reflected her unrivaled position. According to some of New Orleans's, quote, oldest and most respectable white merchants, Eulalie had unlimited credit, and in every sense of the word. So Duncan Kennedy, a white merchant in the city for 40 years, testified that he dealt with the, quote, remarkably industrious and honest Eulalie often. When she came looking to buy, she always brought the money to pay. She could have anything she wanted, he said. She could have obtained from $15,000 to $20,000 of goods on credit from him at any given time. So $15,000 to $20,000 is approximately $510,000 to $685,000 in purchasing power today. An enormous sum. I mean, I don't know. I can't go and summit that kind of credit on my name alone as she could. So this is pretty remarkable. And then also, there's a lot of witnesses who testified to this, a lot of merchants who dealt with her say these things over and over, including one bank president, legislator, and architect of the forestall system of banking, and anybody knows what that is. I shouldn't have said that, because don't ask me to describe. Edmund J. Forstall testified that from about 1810 to 1820, he sold Eulalie goods as a clerk in the house of William Simpson, and that she paid punctually and was, he said, among the clients who bought on the largest scale. So even witnesses for the plaintiffs admitted that Eulalie had good credit and could have whatever she wished. All right, so Eulalie also made money by taking her significant profits from her dry good business and lending it out on interest. So this is not a family that's going to let cash sit idly by, right? So, and here, I think with these particular transactions, we can start to see something of Eulalie's long-term wealth management plan. So in anticipation of the greed of Eugene's white family, Eulalie and Eugene seem to have devised a kind of shrewd strategy to protect what was hers, such that she could bequeath it to their children. So she could pass it on. He couldn't, but she could. So there was no restriction to what Eulalie could pass to their children, so the couple spent his bank account down while running hers up. And they did this through deliberately and publicly building Eulalie's personal economic portfolio. So on this front, she relies on him. She relied on Eugene's expertise as a creditor and permitted him to oversee some of her investments. And he does it by lending it out on interest. And he was a shrewd manager. I mean, he knew how to identify potential borrowers of solid credit and good repute. He knew how to act as an intermediary. He had a desk at the stock exchange, that sort of thing. And so for his trouble, according to a witness for the defense and frequent borrower Casimir Lacoste, Eulalie paid Eugene a 1% commission for conducting these affairs. And that's a pretty typical commission at this time period for paying somebody. So he was paid. And Lacoste himself borrowed $3,000 from her in 1818 and then recollected another 20 transactions after that. And at times he said he went directly to Eulalie for money, but more often she, quote, directed him to Eugene as a matter of convenience, as he could always see McCarty at the exchange without giving himself the trouble of coming to her, end quote. But in each of these transactions, Eugene acted as her paid agent. It was with her money and her name that he did the lending. And I think Lacoste describes it as a matter of convenience, but I think actually this is more than just simple convenience, right? This is also, well, it's many things, but it's also a tactic for keeping the money public and therefore being able to document it as hers. She knows these heirs. She knows Theodore's character. She knows, right? So indeed, so one witness, the widow Chabanais, a neighbor and an intimate acquaintance of the couple and witness for the defense, claimed to be, quote, present at least 30 or 40 times when Eulalie Mandeville gave money to Eugene McCarty to loan on interest. Eugene, she said, also consulted Eulalie about partaking in such and such transaction, and if interested, then she withdrew money from her armoire and gave it to him to manage. So through Eugene and on her own accord, Eulalie lent significant sums of money and enjoyed a healthy profit. Really healthy profit. So extracts from her bank account that she submitted of evidence, because she had, in fact, accounts, show cash deposits from notes collected, so deposits that then witnesses from the bank testified that they saw Eulalie make and thus lay claim to. So these deposits ranged from $2,100 for January of 1831 to 1832 to $51,000 for just the first half of 1837 alone, where money's kind of really freely moving around New Orleans then. At the end of 1837, we have a financial panic and there isn't anymore. But, I mean, she's got the cash in the bank, right? So in 1845 then, just at the eve of the onset of this case when Eugene dies, she had $112,000 in her account at the Bank of Louisiana. All right, so another strategy to combat the schemes of Eugene's white heirs has to do, I think, with documentation, with creating a paper trail. And on that front, Eulalie accumulated and submitted a mountain of evidence to the court to corroborate her case. And she could do so because for years, she and Eugene built a verifiable, official, and public paper trail. So Eulalie provided the court with promissory notes bearing her signature. She provided notarial acts in which borrowers pledged property to pay her back for their loans. She provided excerpts from her bank accounts, like this one, demonstrating large and regular deposits for many years. The accounts that bank clerks testified were hers alone and into which they always saw her do the depositing. She also kept and submitted as evidence investment documents indicating that Eugene acted on her behalf, as well as letters and receipts from borrowers. She presented dozens of witnesses whose testimony told the story of an enterprising woman of good repute who built a successful, lucrative, and extensive dry goods trade, and who lent large amounts of money on interest. And witnesses for the plaintiff further reinforced her account. Yet letters from Eugene's brother and lead plaintiff in the case provided some of the most damning evidence, letters that Eulalie shrewdly kept as a forewarning of Theodore McCarty's avarice. So she submitted 8 letters addressed to my dear Eulalie, my good Eulalie, and in one telling instance simply, please Eulalie, from Theodore beseeching her to lend him money and, quote, come to my rescue. So the letters all express a really similar theme. Theodore, in his words, was penniless, in an unfortunate situation, unable to meet my expenses, and frequently in need of money to buy milk or pay my rent. In each, he begged for small sums ranging from $1 to $20, and then once just sent an IOU along with a letter pledging to pay her back soon. And he made lots of other requests too, like, quote, please send your slave Suzanne to help bathe and serve me. And he appealed to her good heart and asked her for sympathy, claiming, you have done it so often that I'm sure you will do it again. And he ended his letters by thanking her for his kindness and then pledging his endless devotion and love. I mean, over and over, like way too much. And so while he used his lawsuit to claim that the $155,000 belonged to his brother, sorry, I keep getting phone calls too. This is, I need to take the watch off. So while he used this lawsuit to claim that the money belonged to his brother, it was to Eulalie that he appealed to her kindness, to her deep pockets, time and again to bail him out. I only have you who will help me in my unfortunate situation, he wrote her. And even Eugene asked Eulalie to spare him some cash to help his brother. In a letter addressed to Eulalie, Eugene wrote, do me the pleasure of sending me $100. I absolutely need it to pay money for Theodore. Right. So finally, Eulalie ended her case by providing the court with a chronicle backed by more tangible evidence about what came of Eugene's alleged fortune. So he used his money to support and establish their children and gave their children money to invest in a Cuban coffee plantation that went belly up. And to that end, Eulalie provided receipts for the remittances he sent their son, their daughter, and then their son-in-law in Cuba, as well as bank drafts totaling more than $30,000 to help save the operation and disencumber them of debts. She also submitted several letters from her son Bartholomew, apprising his father of the plantation's increasingly desperate financial situation. So the climate turned out to be a bit too warm, and prices fell. And so letters from their children and then from Eugene's Cuban business partners describe, quote, seizures, executions, complaints of bad crops, cries of misery, and calls for money. That the venture proved most disastrous. So in all, Eugene lost between $40,000 and $45,000. So he may have once held a fortune of roughly $57,000, she said. Not 100, 57. But by the early 1840s, the amount was reduced to the $12,000 that he left behind and distributed to his collateral heirs in his will as required by law. I should stop and just say that I think this loss is also a strategy. So an attempt to move the bulk of his cash offshore to keep it from passing into the hands of his relatives. I have a lot more Cuba research to do, but the loss also seems to me to be exaggerated somewhat. And while this was a legitimate investment, that he did buy, in fact, 2 coffee plantations, I think it was primarily a way of passing money to his children living there and then parking it outside of the jurisdiction of the Louisiana probate courts. All right, so what happened? Maybe. There we go, all right. How did it end? Not the way the plaintiffs had hoped. They lost. So, fraud cannot be presumed, wrote Judge E.A. Cannon of the 2nd District Court of New Orleans. Such an accusation is easily brought, but must be strictly proven. And in this case, the judge surmised the plaintiffs failed to substantiate their accusations of fraud. Instead, the evidence presented by both sides convinced him that the property in question belonged to Eulalie. The evidence, he wrote in his final judgment, taken together with the bank account always kept in Eulalie's name, is very strong and hardly leaves any room to doubt. So he dismissed the case as a non-suit, and he ordered the plaintiffs to pay the costs. They appealed. And in their appeal, they made every effort to discredit Eulalie and present Eugene as her victim. And here, they moved beyond using terms like concubine as a sort of shorthand to signify illegitimacy and race and that sort of thing, and started making really explicitly racialized arguments and accusations. And in a remarkable 29-page brief to the Supreme Court of Louisiana, which is really long for this time period, they relied just on a lot of rhetorical questions, inferences, conjecture, and disparagement. In particular, they attempted to undercut her as Eugene's legitimate partner and a viable economic actor in her own right by, again, painting her as a small-time peddler, despite all, they just ignore all of her evidence. They say nothing of it and just ignore it. And then they paint her as worse, as a blood-sucking temptress. So the plaintiffs then, in their determination to frame the issue as one involving the problem of race and of intergenerational wealth transfer, they devoted considerable space to the specter of miscegenation. Here, they hoped the court would bypass the evidence that the property was Eulalie's and make their ruling on racial ideology alone. So specifically, they addressed mixed-race partnerships and the procreation of mixed-race children and the transmission of property out of white hands. Eulalie and Eugene had lived, they said, in an antisocial state. Their relationship violated the good morals of civilized countries. Only marriage, they railed, had the protection of laws and of religion, and cohabitation was prohibited. And while they didn't specifically reference here relationships between white men and black women, their disapproval is implied. So they used, again, still using terms like cohabitation and concubinage as shorthand for partnerships like that of Eugene and Eulalie's. But they also presented Eulalie and her children as vultures, as gleefully stealing white property and celebrating Eugene's death as their final triumph. So Eugene's son, Eugene Jr., laughed, they said, when asked about his father's illness. He wasn't grieving, they concluded, for this moment was indeed about joy, they said. Eugene Sr. should have known better, and others should take heed. Quote, what a lesson does this scene not offer to these men who, trampling underfoot of all social conveniences, satisfy their wild passions and die in their bed of agony. So a sad tableau indeed, right? An old man besieged on his deathbed by carrion birds. And this was, they said, a terrible price that he paid for his indiscretions. Quote, instead of a legitimate family to assist and console them, only birds of prey who take advantage of this solemn moment to strip them. So the plaintiff's reference to the wild passions of birds of prey invoked familiar stereotypes about the amorous and predatory mulatress, a seductress with an infinite passion for opulence whose sexual charms incited white men into immoral and injurious relationships. So the mulatress, usually cast as a light-skinned free woman of color, entered into such partnerships not out of love or genuine feeling, but out of greed. And these were really well-known 19th century tropes. They were present in Louisiana and then throughout the Caribbean. And according to the stereotype, the sexually precocious mulatress sought economically advantageous relationships, thereby stripping white men of their property and cheating potential white wives out of the economic security that marriage should provide. So men like Eugene lavished their mistresses with every luxury, leaving their legitimate white family in destitution. The mulatress was a danger to the stability of white property, and then by extension, the stability of white society more generally. But the gravest danger for white property wasn't the temptress, but her interracial children. So that Eugene's property remained in Eulalie's hands to pass to her illegitimate children was both an insult and a threat. So in their mind, the high court needed to do what the lower court would not, to protect the sanctity of property by returning it to the plaintiffs, who would thus then reinsert it within the matrix of a respectable and legitimate white family, who would presumably then pass it on to their own accordingly. And so by depicting Eulalie and her children in this way, the plaintiffs hoped that the courts would consider the threat they thought she posed when making their ruling. And remember, this is now an appellate case, so their decision is going to be binding precedent. I should just say, though, that this depiction of Eulalie came entirely from the plaintiffs and their attorneys, not from the witnesses from themselves, either the plaintiffs or for the defense, whose collective portrayal of her betrayed not a hint of such racialized or sexualized stereotypes. It just comes from the plaintiffs. All right. They don't succeed. They had pinned their hopes on the right of property, and they assumed that the lower court judge and later the state Supreme Court justices would equate the right of property transmission with normative white lineages, so those sanctioned by traditional forms of marriage rather than concubinage and protected from the threat of miscegenation. And they expected that the courts would protect the interests of the white heirs and agree that Eulalie's race and gender disqualified her as a legitimate partner and property holder. Interestingly enough, though, race and gender really didn't figure much into either court's opinion. The morality of Eulalie and Eugene's relationship only garnered just a few comments from either the lower or appellate court. Instead, both ruled on the question of the sanctity of property and the intergenerational transfer of wealth, just not in the way that the plaintiffs had hoped. So the stability of fortunes is one of the greatest bases of society. This is what the lower court judge wrote in his opinion. The stability of fortunes is one of the greatest bases of society. And this, of course, is what undergirds a slave society, right? This ability to own people as property. But, he said, in this instance, the fortune belonged to Eulalie, a free black woman. And the Supreme Court of Louisiana concurred. The court found that, quote, the weight of the evidence supported Eulalie's claim. The property was a product of her economical and orderly habits, her good judgment and thrift. They said it didn't belong to to Eugene, and they can perceive no disguise or indirection in these transactions. And they found no evidence of fraud. They said they are, of course, sensitive to the appeals to morals, religion, and social order, but they said it would be an abuse to bring them into conflict with the right of property. They said Eulalie, quote, based her defense on that right, and we find no warrant in law or evidence for disturbing her in the enjoyment of the fruits of her labor and the thrift of a long life. All right, so, and then they conclude this way, which I think is quite amazing. 5 months after the Supreme Court of Louisiana affirmed her right to the fruits of her labor, Eulalie Mandeville died. And when she died, the entirety of her fortune passed to her children, as she and presumably Eugene had intended. And it was uncontested, it moved quickly to them, and so on. And her fortune, moreover, only grew in the hands of her heirs. When her last living child, Pierre Villaroso McCarty, died in 1878, he left behind an estate of worth $182,000, so about $6 million today, which he bequeathed to Eulalie's grandchildren and great-grandchildren. He never married, neither did 4 of his brothers, so a bulk of it went to the kids of 2 children. All right, I'm over time. All right, so let me conclude and quickly. So I'm afraid to ask the question, what should we make of this case? There are many things to take away, but I just want to leave us today with perhaps just one way of thinking about it, and that actually has to do with documentation and with the shaping of narratives. So This is in many ways a pretty extraordinary case, I know that. But there are many thousands of records of legal transactions involving Black Americans scattered throughout the civil courts of the American South and beyond. And a huge number of these are frankly boring. They document transactions that are, on the face of it anyway, quite regular, quite predictable. So things like simple debt recovery or a battle over back wages or something like that. But I think that Eulalie's case is salutary for thinking through even these everyday transactions. Because behind each one of these, there was also a strategy or a set of strategies, an attempt to fix in writing and then have validated by a state authority, so in this case the court, a particular understanding of one's own past, present, and future within or in opposition to the challenges posed by living in a society that's marked by a specific racial caste hierarchy. So I think that one of the things we see in Eulalie's case is that her and Eugene's particular estate plan was made in anticipation of precisely the issue she ended up in court over. And during the course of many years, they assiduously constructed a wealth management strategy and a set of documents attesting to it to keep Eugene's family out of their money and move wealth to their children, whose rights of inheritance the law did not protect. And so she spent decades building a documentary record in anticipation of the greed of Eugene's white relatives, knowing in all likelihood that they could and would rely on racial arguments to prevail over her wealth. And as I said before, she knows her brother-in-law, right? She knows Theodore McCarty's character well. So I think that McCarty v. Mandeville, therefore, also offers some insight into how Black Americans managed risk in a racially unequal society and how they built financial structures that would anticipate the schemes of a set of grasping white potential heirs. And finally, by building such a record, by producing it, by saving it, by submitting it, we see how Eulalie herself set the terms of the debate and shaped the narrative told in court. Eulalie's documentary strategy, long-term, public, forward-thinking, involved harnessing or controlling the events of the past, right? Conditioning the realities of the present through selective and careful curation. Right? She's deciding the story that is being submitted here in order to shape the future and to shape the future for her children. So documentation then was meaning generating. So by submitting her evidence, both oral and written to the court, by having it be part of a public record now, she had it authenticated. She authenticated it and then she had it authenticated for herself, but especially for the future use of her children and their children. For it was her version of family that received the backing of the court and of the state. Indeed, Eulalie had succeeded in getting the courts, local and appellate, to concede that the stability of fortunes included the right to secure the future of families like her own. They too could lay claim to intergenerational wealth and the birthrights of a respectable and legitimate family. And securing that future was her lifetime's work. Thank you. I went over time, sorry.
Extraordinary woman of labor and erudition, I would say. We have, of course, time for a few questions. Perhaps from the students, of course, who have also been looking at the ways in which terms are being used and evidence is being amassed and texts are being understood.
And read very, very, very closely.
I did threaten them yesterday, so it's fine.
So just to be clear, I looked back to see if they had one for us. Since her
I can hear you.
was to create intergenerational wealth, I'm wondering, are there any living heirs, and actually what the race of those heirs are?
That's a really good question. So I don't yet know if there are living heirs. I suspect, but I don't yet know. And so they had 7 children that lived to adulthood. Only 2 married. So the rest died, were men who lived together, who dealt in a block, and so on. And I think this in some ways, I see this as a strategy with some other families that have similar wealth, that kind of keeping money close. The 2 that married moved to Cuba, and from what I can figure out from the records there, became white. Yeah, yeah. And then, and I don't fully know. Again, I have to still do this research, more of this research, but they registered all their children's births under white baptisms, and they were called Don and Donna, which would be a term for a white planter. And then her granddaughter Isabel married a man named Edward Phelps from Massachusetts, and that wouldn't have been a white man, and that wouldn't have been possible if she was considered a woman of color. And then they all moved to some stay in Cuba. That doesn't really work well with the revolution, and then they moved to Europe. Yeah. Is the last one I've been able to trace so far that I know of died at the turn of the 20th century, Isabel, in Paris. But that seemed to be a place where a lot of these wealthy free people of color moved in the wake of the war, of the Civil War, where they are, where they're degraded to a single racialized category, and then face the same kind of violence and indignities as did, these 4 million newly freed people in the Jim Crow era, right? So it's a good question. I have lots of stuff to figure out on that front.
Hi, my name is Kalina Waiters. My question is, what impacted you to pursue this study?
I'm sorry?
What impacted you to pursue this study?
What impacted me? Well, so I kind of found her on accident. My first book was a study of free black and enslaved people suing whites in the courts of the civil courts of Mississippi and Louisiana before the Civil War, and they similarly won a lot of the time, and so I wrote about that, and then one of the chapters I wrote on was debt recovery, because the most common lawsuit involving a black plaintiff and a white defendant was a lawsuit to recover a debt owed. And I started thinking, well, who are all these money lenders? I didn't know they were creditors too. We don't think of them as litigants. So there's a hidden history there. And now this project is a hidden history of commerce and finance and black wealth in a way that I think we didn't quite know. So I never thought when I was sitting in basements of Mississippi courthouses that I would, reading one debt case after another where like some white guy sues another white guy over $30, I'd be standing, it was really boring, and I'd be standing here. So I was so sick of debt, but here we are. But here we are.
Hello, my name's Nicole Miller. I have a question if they donated to any minority communities or if they created a nonprofit.
I don't know, and that's a really good question. So I know that in their wills, they did not leave money behind for those kinds of things. Except for Pierre Villaroso Marcardi, who died later in 1878. He did leave behind some charitable things for an orphanage, I believe, but it doesn't specify whether that's for a minority community or not. I would guess, given the state of the city in that time period, in the sort of late Reconstruction era, that it would be. But other than that, I don't know. And I do know that, I mean, they provided loans for, and they did, served as signatories for loans. They did a lot of sort of community building and other sorts of things that I can trace, but I don't know about charitable giving.
Like, when they were alive, how involved were they with the community, allowing them to establish a foundational access for like people who are just coming in from overseas, allowing there to be opportunities for people who are not slaves?
So you're talking from like Saint-Domingue or something like that, or
Just like in general, from your own like background knowledge, what you're able to provide to
what
like,
they were able to provide? I mean, they were really important members and part of a really close-knit and quite large population of free people of color in Louisiana, or in New Orleans in this time period. And they were, of course, she's of course quite wealthy and owned enslaved people herself, right? Which is one of these awful ironies of a woman who was born enslaved, but this is quite common in this time period and in this place and in the Caribbean more generally. But this was a very, New Orleans had, in the 19th century, had one of the biggest, most vibrant populations of free people of color, only rivaled by, say, Baltimore or maybe, at least in the slave South. There's about 250,000 of free people of color living in the slave South before the Civil War, but 4 million enslaved people. And a lot of them live in New Orleans. And so there are all the kinds of things that sustain a community there as a result from informal sort of schooling, kind of pre-real public school, to mutual aid societies, to hospitals, to all those sorts of things. And by all accounts, this family was embedded in that. But she's also quite embedded in the community from which her father came, right? So like she, unlike most free people of color who are living on the margins and face re-enslavement and violent kidnapping and all those things, she's protected by that because of who she is and who supports her. And I'll say, I mean, her lawyers are two of the most high-powered men in Louisiana. One goes on to be a senator, and she's just like marching in there with these guys who really are there, I mean, she has the connections to and the witnesses in the case, as far as I can tell, there's only one out of dozens, only one other person of color, and that is it. It is all whites. Which is really interesting and telling, right? Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sarah. This is more of a group question for our class. Ooh, ooh. And so I guess we wanted to know more about how this specific case set the precedence for interracial marriage, especially in the South, because of, some of the things that you mentioned regarding like marriage and at the time. And if maybe during your research, if you maybe came across something on how it also impacted civil rights. Thank you.
Yeah. So first things, it remains illegal until Loving, until well into the 20th century with the Loving, Virginia case for the interracial marriage. It just is banned. And so it doesn't do anything there. But it does. So one of the things I think is really interesting about this case and the way that the court decided it, which is kind of counterintuitive to what we think would happen in a slave society, right? Because they could have easily just been like, yeah, we're going to go with this. We're going with this. This isn't hers. That's really fraud. I mean, this is kind of on the line, right? I mean, I think it's quite shrewd, not fraud, and there's a difference. But the courts I found in this case and others like it, and other cases involving people of African descent and property disputes, is that, in a slaveholding society like this one, the two pillars of that society are white supremacy and private property, right? And that they are, it's the whole thing. Those are intimately linked together. They uphold that whole society. But there are moments like this when they come into tension with one another, and where the court has to decide if it's going to open Pandora's box one way or the other. Like, are we going to allow, and this comes back to your question about civil rights, right? Like, are we going to allow a black woman to stand up here and have legal personhood and recognize her as a legal person and as an actor in her own right? Are we going to shut it down and protect property, or are we going to shut it down and put the rights of property in jeopardy? Because it's her property, right? So they don't want to open Pandora's box with upsetting property rights. And so then that has the corollary of people who own things, black people who own things, to come in and kind of break open that space and take advantage of the tensions in that system. And when left with the awkward choice of choosing between white supremacy and property rights, they always do property rights, like always, and so on. So then that gives this space for these people to come in and claim rights. And I think this is, the civil rights movement keeps getting longer and longer, right? But this is, these are people who are claiming, to secure their own future, right? Claiming to be recognized and to have their claims recognized by a state authority, and to have somebody else be accountable to them. And they're, exercising due process and any number of other things that we think of as civil rights later on. And they're doing so. Many of them were born enslaved, right?
Thank you. This was just wonderful. It was my impression that Louisiana is the only state that follows the Napoleonic Code.
Yes.
And in that code, I'm just trying to remember, it was established by, I think, 1805
Oh, yeah.
by the
Yep.
commission that set it up. I'm just trying to remember the rights of illegitimate children in the revolution in 92 were never recognized.
Yeah.
Despite the campaigns.
Mm-hmm.
And I know the code didn't either.
Yeah. So
How do you account for this difference in New Orleans, that property trumps the birthright or non-birthright?
yeah, this is a good question. For Eulalie, it's kind of a moot point by that point, or by the time she's being sued, and that's because while Louisiana still follows the civil law, Louisiana had long been part of the national union, right? It's been long part of the federal union. So there's a lot of movement of judges and lawyers and legal professionals and so on that changed the tenor of that a little bit. But this kind of change to disqualify natural children and also her partners of whites occurred beginning in 1808 and then really in 1825. So she and Eugene had 15 years of a relationship together beforehand, and so the only document that the plaintiffs have it's a will of his from, I think, about 1806, where he gives them everything. He gives it all he doesn't have a lot, he has about $25,000 at that time period, and he gives it all to his children with Eulalie and to her, because he can then. But you know, the demographics of New Orleans in particular really start changing in those years. And part of what made these relationships possible has to do with demographics, to put it kind of crudely, because there weren't a lot of white women. There are far more, and there weren't a lot of free men of color. So, there's a ban of marriage also between slaves and free blacks. So there wasn't enough people to enter, right. So we see a lot of these relationships in those early years, in early Louisiana, these marriage-like partnerships between mostly Frenchmen and black women, some Native American women. And then as demographics change, that starts to change, and then white people think it's a problem, and they start passing laws to stop it, right? But there are all kinds of cases like this, perhaps not to this extent with this big of a fortune, of white men and black women figuring out all sorts of creative ways to bypass these laws. And they're often quite successful. Not always, certainly not always. And the Louisiana Supreme Court cites in this case a couple of others, just a couple previous years before, that they ruled differently. But they still sometimes have a card to play.
This is really terrific, which raises the question, what are your publishing visions for the future? And how about a TV series or an action film? Yeah.
Well, my agent's in the room.
Okay. I mean,
I'm working on a book, among many other things, and a story of her family across probably 150 years. It'll probably end with a court case from the 1950s where it's distant relatives of hers. Same in Louisiana, same type of stuff: marriage, illegitimacy, sexuality, inheritance. And the court in 1950 rules for the whites and keeps the property there. Right. So it'll be. I got to explain that change. Yeah. It is. I'm going to do it. Thank you so much.
And this comes to the end. However, I do want to make a moment for the students just to know that there is also a Cammett scholarship, which we encourage you to apply for about such things. But certainly, this is wonderful. Thanks, of course, to Sandy Cooper and the Cammett family. Thanks to Adwa for her organization. Thanks to all the people there. It's been wonderful. And I look forward to seeing everyone same bat time, same bat channel next year.